Welcome everyone to the Congogram webinar. We have with us today the Reverend Dr. Lynn Acquafondata, who works as a pastoral counselor at the Counseling and Family Family Therapy Group in Rochester, New York. She developed this Congogram system for use in counseling congregations by using a systems model that's based, it's similar to the genogram system that's used in family systems, and she's developed one that works with congregational systems. So today you're going to get a chance to hear about the model and see how it can be applied in congregations. Lynn is an ordained minister who served congregations and has also worked as a chaplain in both hospital and hospice settings. She has a Doctor of Ministry and also a Master of Counseling. And so she has a lot of knowledge and experience that she's going to share with us today. And so with that, I am going to let Lynn go ahead and share her presentation.
Thank you so much, Renee, and thank you everybody for participating today. I'd like to begin with a prayer. As we join together today, let us give thanks for churches, synagogues, temples, sanghas, covens, meetings, and all of the diverse religious and spiritual homes that nurture our souls and help us to live up to our highest values. Sometimes these organizations, like all human communities, struggle and fail to live up to the ideals they espouse. And sometimes we too fail to live up to our deeply held beliefs. May the work we do here today strengthen us and strengthen our communities so that we can indeed live up to our highest values and make a difference in the world through our faith communities. God bless the work we do today and bless our religious and spiritual homes. I am pleased to be able to share with you today my Congogram counseling system that I developed. The presentation is going to be divided into 3 parts: examine the past, identify patterns in the present, and create a vital future. So we'll begin with examine the past. The Congogram is a visual tool that examines the root causes of current issues in congregations. It works on strengthening the roots of a congregation in order to build a healthier future. The process examines and maps the past in order to understand the present and to identify patterns, and then create a vital future by helping us make informed and thoughtful choices and setting clear goals. Visual tools are very useful because they take complex information and simplify it so that it can be easily grasped by the eye, quickly processed in the brain, making that information easier to comprehend and to remember and to work with in creative kinds of ways. The Congogram works with emotional systems in religious organizations, and that is focusing on the ways that people act, react, and interact from an emotional perspective. It helps members of congregations to see patterns and observe the repetition of those patterns through the generations oftentimes. People in congregations often have different understandings of what leads to good relationship and positive interaction. Those understandings often come out of what we learned growing up, but they also come from unspoken and deeply held ethical and moral ideals. Because we are not always on the same page, this can sometimes cause conflict that might not be easily seen or understood without some serious reflection. The model that the Congogram uses is systems theory, and it continues the work of systems theory thinkers like Murray Bowen and Edwin Friedman. The Congogram benefits a variety of congregations from different faiths, and therefore the basic process does not use theological language, though theological language could be incorporated in work with a specific congregation if that's helpful. The process can be beneficial for any congregation, but it's especially helpful for congregations that are experiencing transition, for example, leadership change or a physical move, for congregations experiencing serious conflict between groups or leaders, those preparing for a new challenge, or congregations that are experiencing trauma in the past are experiencing it in the present. For example, sexual abuse by a leader, the sudden death of a clergy person, or tragedy in the congregation. Or sometimes congregations have a strong negative energy, for example, conflictual, stagnant, or indecisive. And these congregations can very much benefit from this model. The congogram is both a process of working with a congregation using a systems model, and it's also a concrete mapping tool which is used to identify and work with patterns of behavior and interaction. The counseling aspect involves group sessions and individual sessions and also work with the congregation as a whole. And I will talk about that in detail in a few minutes. But I'd like to introduce the visual tool first. The congogram mapping tool, like Renee said, does for a congregation what a genogram does for a family. And I'm just going to flip ahead one slide. This is a picture of a basic genogram. It's in the form of a family tree, but then it maps out the emotional interactions between people in the family. This is the equivalent diagram for a congregation, but because congregations are much more complex, the model is also itself much more complex. So the basic format, instead of being in a family tree, is in a spiral. And the idea of that is that it's much less clear what is a generation in a congregation than in a family. Is it the length of one clergy person's tenure, or the founding members and the children of the founding members? It's just, there's no like clear delineation. And so the spiral gives that sense of layers of time and history and the continuation and the way the patterns repeat in a more continuous kind of format. The spiral line itself is a timeline. So in the very center of the spiral is the beginning of the history of that congregation. And then on the outside of the spiral is the present time in the congregation. That picture of the congogram is then broken down into individual segments. And this is where the detailed diagram symbols come in. Now, you will not be able to read really clearly in these pictures right here, the detailed symbols, but we are going to look more closely at some of those symbols, so don't worry, you'll be learning about those soon. So these are portions from the larger spiral, and then they're used to map out some emotional systems type interactions that happen in those time periods. Within each of the detailed diagrams, there are various tools that are used. Symbols are used. Many of the symbols are taken from the genogram. For example, circle as the symbol for female, square as the symbol for a male. And then emotional connections is the parallel, a close connection. Zigzag line shows tension between two people. A dotted line shows a distance between two people, emotional distance between two people. But in addition to that, I developed some symbols that are specific to congregations. And these are a couple of them. There are many more, but a couple of them as a sample. A committee is a circle with 3 people inside of it. There's a symbol for a board, which is a triangle, and then a line underneath representing each board member. Clergy would be a symbol for either male or female, but then a smaller circle inside representing that they are ordained clergy. And then a symbol for the denomination is 3 buildings with a circle on top. I also developed a symbol for anxiety because I don't think you can talk about emotional systems in congregations without talking about anxiety. The model also uses color to express emotional qualities. The basic color meanings are taken from the generally accepted meanings of colors in Western society. But what each color represents can be adjusted based on the culture of the congregation. The idea is that certain colors evoke certain meanings quickly and subconsciously. The model taps into that visual aspect of our processing, and so it's very important that it be culturally relevant. And I do check with congregations before working with them to make sure that those colors do represent the way people in that congregation connect with those colors. This is one of the detailed section diagrams from the St. John's Episcopal Congregation on the West Coast. How information is collected to form these detailed diagrams is just as important as what is actually shown in the diagrams. And that's why counseling skills are used both in the group sessions and in the individual sessions. The whole process involves a combination of both group and individual sessions. If you look at this diagram, I'm just going to highlight a couple points on it. The rainbow there stands out pretty prominently, and you can see parallel lines connecting to the ordination of the first openly gay Bishop, Gene Robinson. So this is about the congregation's connection to that event in the denomination. In the center, you'll see a circle for committee. It's in brown. It's a circle with 3 people in the center of it. And at that period in time, you could see a black line. It's a zigzag line going between the committee, and up at the top, right next to the word stability, right before the word stability, is a symbol for the rector, who's the clergy person of that congregation, a circle with another circle inside. So you can see that there was tension between the clergy person and this committee. You can also see to the right of the symbol for the clergy person, up towards the top, a symbol for the diocese and the bishop. And there's an arrow pointing down towards the board and the committee there. The diocese did get involved in the situation, but the tension was directed towards the clergy person. You see the arrow directing towards the clergy person. There is a full case study of this in one of the online courses that can be purchased on the website. But basically what happened here is that the way that the clergy person dealt with this situation ended up being very healing, and it led to a period of stability afterwards. And that's represented not just by the word stability, but by the colors blue, and for the yellow symbolizes joy, and the blue kind of stability and peace and that kind of thing. So that's kind of a quick example of how this works. Our next section, identify patterns in the present. The Congogram process is a partnership between the Congogram consultant, which would be myself, the clergy person or people in the congregation, lay leadership in the congregation, and then the congregation as a whole. Without committed leadership on site, a clergy person and or lay leaders, the work can't be completed effectively. The Congogram process has 6 parts that are spread over an approximate 6-month period, including follow-up evening meetings and phone calls as needed. And the on-site leadership is especially important in getting commitment to the process and doing the work that takes place in between the sessions. And this is why the first step of the process begins with leadership in the congregation, both official and unofficial leaders in the congregation. The first step is called the present through new eyes, the first step of a 6-step process. It's also the least costly part of the process, and it really sets the groundwork for the whole Congogram program. It can be used to determine whether a congregation is willing and ready to engage in the entire process, so you don't have to make a commitment to the whole process to start here. The present through new eyes uses a participatory visual process which allows the current life of the congregation to unfold before leaders in a new way. Strengths and challenges are named and presented in a safe and supportive format that begins that process of reflection that's so important to the Congogram, and it initiates a subtle but important shift in perspective. This is a 2-hour workshop for leaders, which is then followed either that day or another day by a 1-hour introduction to systems work and to the congregation process as a whole. Congregations generally start the Congogram process with a particular goal in mind. Goals could include learning to handle a particular conflict situation in a productive and healing manner, helping leaders and congregants to recognize emotional systems patterns and to reflect on their individual roles in the continuation of the patterns, identifying which patterns are constructive and working to change those, or working to enhance those, or which patterns are destructive and then working to change those. Or formulating an action plan, including congregational goals related to emotional process and the steps to make that a reality. As I said, self-reflection is absolutely crucial to the Congogram process, and so it's fostered throughout the process in a number of ways. This is the main reason that the 6 parts of the process need to be spread out by approximately at least 2 weeks, up to 4 weeks between the parts. This is similar to the way in which in individual and family counseling, it's done generally a week between sessions, because a lot of internal processing happens between the sessions, and that is very important to the changes that take place. Sometimes in the Congogram process, specific homework is assigned, and sometimes it just takes advantage of that normal processing that happens after in-depth work has taken place. The Congogram process is all about patterns, and we will go into some details on that. So it begins with the official and unofficial leaders, then members and leaders share perspectives on key events in the history of the organization and reflect on it from an emotional systems perspective. And then it breaks down into small groups, and I'll say more about that, to focus on different periods of time. Then the congregational counselor prepares a detailed set of the congogram diagrams and a very detailed written analysis of the emotional systems patterns present throughout the history of the congregation. The congregation comes to understand the ways in which the current patterns often have deep roots in the history of the congregation. And this includes healthy patterns as well as conflictual ones. Participants reflect on their own role in the system and learn skills for continuing this reflection on an ongoing basis. Eventually, the congregation evaluates which system patterns have served them well and are worth continuing and enhancing, and which patterns have been problematic and could benefit from change. I'm going to present a piece of a detailed case study. This is from the West Coast Unitarian Universalist congregation. This is a mid-sized congregation with 300 adult members and 100 children. It began in 1949 as a result of the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship movement. They welcomed their first clergy person in 1952. Since then, this congregation has had 7 settled ministers and 1 interim minister. 6 of the settled ministers had unhappy partings with the congregation, including the deaths of 2 ministers. Significant events in the history of the congregation include a minister who died of cancer in the 1970s, a tumultuous 8-year period in the 1990s, which ended in the negotiated resignation of a long-term clergy person, Reverend Bob, followed by a split-off of a significant portion of the congregation. The dynamic in the congregation changed significantly after that. They had a relatively peaceful 11 years with Reverend Coe, the clergy person who followed. During that time, there was a traumatic event on Christmas Eve of 2007, which seriously affected the congregation, but they were able to deal with it constructively. At that time, 5 members of the congregation were killed in a car crash outside of the church on Christmas Eve, including 3 adults and 2 children. And for those of you who are trying to figure out which congregation this is, I'll let you know that all of the details and the names of the clergy and the congregants have been fictionalized to preserve the privacy of this congregation. What's been preserved is the emotional intensity of the content, and that's really the important part. The West Coast Unitarian Universalist congregation came to the Congogram process out of a desire for self-reflection. The congregation was getting ready for ministerial transition. Reverend Coe had just announced his resignation. It appeared like it would be the first peaceful transition for the congregation in decades. The goal for them was to get an overall sense of the strengths and challenges in the emotional systems of the congregation in order to move into a healthy future when they called their next settled clergy person. The process began with me working with official and unofficial leaders of the congregation, including the current minister, the board of trustees, former key leaders of the congregation, long-term members of the congregation who others look to as representing the congregation. I began some of the individual interviews with some of these leaders, eventually interviewing around 20 to 25 people. In addition, I later in the process interviewed one of the previous people by phone. The individual interviews include questions which encourage people to share personal views on the core mission of the congregation and how that's lived out, as well as naming the strengths and challenges of their personal involvement over the years. In this case, the sessions also included reflection on personal and family systems issues, as well as congregational systems issues. With these individual interviews, I do not use specific content from those interviews unless the person gives me permission or if they're sharing commonly known details. These interviews are used to gain a sense of common themes regarding emotional reactions to events. The next thing that takes place in the process is if there is a written history available, I do read that, or I gather written history from people who have been there a long time. Then I break the history into time periods. In this case, with the West Coast Unitarian Universalist congregation, I broke it into 4 time periods. And these are time periods during which people who are present in the congregation now were alive and participating in the congregation. So congregations with a much older history, we are not able to go back and interview people who were there at that time, obviously. So then the history is broken down into these 4 time segments, and then I meet with small groups of people who are present at each of those times. In this case, those groups, small groups, ranged from 10 to 20 people, and some of the time periods we had more than one group per time period. During these sessions, I facilitate discussion of key events in the history of the congregation during that time, and specifically how people responded to these events from an emotional perspective, including reactions and interactions. I began by asking people to name their own personal responses to those events, and then what did they observe in others. After all of those small group sessions and the individual sessions, I spent considerable time on my own organizing and analyzing all of the information. And this is the stage during which I compile the diagrams that you're seeing pieces of here, and also the detailed written analysis. So today I'm going to give a sample of some of the kinds of information that's included in this kind of analysis. The Congogram analysis of WVC-UUC identified some key themes that came up repeatedly over the history of the congregation, which included strengths as well as areas that had posed challenge throughout the history of the congregation. Some of those areas of strength included resilience, creativity, and the central role of the minister. 3 areas of congregational life that have repeatedly caused tension in the congregation over the years have included money, often associated in one way or another to the congregation's relationship with the minister, children, and social justice. Now, tension in a congregation is not necessarily a bad thing. Tension is energy, which can be directed in many different ways. At WCUUC, the energy of tension has often been directed in certain ways, and these are some of those ways. The patterns include engaging in a new initiative which directs the energy towards a positive goal, forming of factions or split-offs in which groups of people leave the congregation, or a third way is reaching out and support from experts outside the congregation. Today I'm going to take one of these areas of tension, money, and show what can be determined from a congogram analysis that could be used to benefit the congregation. So the next slide shows there were significant financial tensions at the time of the resignation of Reverend Bob. There has been often tension at this congregation over the minister's salary and consistently tension over money in one way or another when a minister leaves. To analyze this tension using the congogram, one could look through the individual diagrams. I think there are about 8 or 10 individual diagrams, Every time the dark green appears, that represents money. So every time dark green appears, you will notice throughout these diagrams that tension lines also appear. And significantly, there are often a symbol for groups of people leaving the congregation or for a minister leaving the congregation when issues of money come up. Often, groups of people either resign or pull back from participation or form factions in the congregation in relation to money issues. So the Congogram analysis goes through each of these points in great detail. I'm just going to show a highlight of it today. If you're interested in more detail, you can examine the full case study, which is available in Course 2A, which is for lay leaders, which can be purchased on the website. I'm going to talk about 2 points in time relating to the emotional systems and money. So financial tension escalated leading up to and after the resignation of Reverend Bob. After his resignation, it focused on the severance package. And if you look at this diagram, you can see some triangles of emotional interaction happening here. There's 2 significant ones. Up in the upper part of the diagram here, you have the symbol for the foundation, and I'm going to talk more about exactly what that is later, but right now just note that. And then there's a bright red tension line that's between that and the symbol for Reverend Bob. Now, the symbol that's used here is actually the symbol for a clergy person who is no longer present in the congregation, but who continues to have a strong influence. So this is the symbol for the ghost of Reverend Bob, so to speak. Even though he was alive, his presence continuing to be there. So Reverend Bob and the foundation, tremendous amount of attention. You will notice the board over to the right of the foundation. There's a close connection between the board and the foundation at this time, but the board is kind of away from the main focus of the tension. And then if you look to the right, there's another triangle that we can see. The red circle with people in it in the middle is the Religious Education Committee. And if you look to sort of to the right of that, there are 3 parallel black lines. That shows a close connection, actually an overly close connection, between the Religious Education Committee and Reverend Bob. And then the tension line is representing tension between the Religious Education Committee and the congregation. So there again, a triangle, the congregation, the Religious Education Committee, and Reverend Bob. And what happened here is this arrow pointing away from the congregation shows 129 adults and children left the congregation and formed a new church as a result of all the tension that was happening. So in a sense, the tension that took place at this time was resolved by all these people leaving. But of course, that left great grief and a big hole in the congregation. Financial tensions had a long history in the congregation. Reverend Bob's resignation involved these issues of the separate foundation that I mentioned. This foundation had been created in the 1980s, and at the time, Reverend Bob strongly opposed it. The foundation is an organization that was run by church members, but it was separate from the church, not part of the church governance structure. The organization was developed to raise money and give money to worthy charitable causes, but that also included church programs as well as programs in the larger community. Now, the formation of the foundation could be viewed either as a very creative approach to dealing with financial issues, or it could be seen as a way for a group of people to pull back from full participation in the congregation, not engaging in an actual split-off, but holding back from full financial participation. Reverend Bob saw it in this later, more negative way. But members of the congregation did agree. Some people believed this was really a wonderful, creative, powerful thing for the congregation. But because of Reverend Bob's opposition, the brunt of the tension was directed towards him. And so you can see this in the tension lines that are between the foundation. At this point, it's that zigzag black line between that and Reverend Bob off to the right. So you see the history of tension between the foundation and Reverend Bob goes back quite a ways. This next diagram is the tumultuous 8-year period from 1990 to 1998, during which tension increased between the minister and the congregation, and relationships began to factionalize. Factions began to develop, and that's symbolized by the pro the minister and anti the minister with the smiles and the frowns up there. So in the small group sessions, particularly in one of the small group sessions that focused on this time period, it stirred up strong emotions by those who had been present at that time. And some of them came to realize that they were still influenced, their current behaviors were influenced by what had happened in that time period, even though they thought that they had set it aside. The other thing that happened, they realized that they were acting in the present out of reaction to their past tensions and fears. And they were able to learn how to maybe redirect their energy. For people who had not been present during this time period, the analysis was eye-opening because it explained some interactional aspects in the current life of the congregation that hadn't made any sense. For example, some tension that was starting to bubble relating to finances and the upcoming resignation of Reverend Coe just didn't make any sense, but in the light of this history, it did. Now, one of the things that happened right after the resignation of Reverend Bob is that the foundation is the one that paid the severance package. And so for one of the individuals who was present during that time and had a personal revelation was Sandra, the treasurer. She was a part of the foundation and a part of this process. There was significant tension around money at that time, not just as a result of the minister leaving, but the years of tension building up to it. During the process, Sandra, the treasurer, found herself reacting very strongly to the discussions regarding the resignation of Reverend Bob. She said, "I felt that anger coming back strongly, but it all happened 20 years ago. I should be over this by now." And indeed, she thought she was over it. As she engaged in some more individual one-on-one work, she was able to name her own role in the process and to think about changing how it influenced her current patterns of response and thinking of ways to change that. So this kind of work has the potential to affect the congregation as a whole. As we saw, the tensions in this time period led to a very tumultuous resignation of Reverend Bob. After that time period, things in the congregation stabilized. And significantly, Reverend Coe's resignation in 2011 did not involve significant financial tension. There are some pockets of underlying negativity regarding money and a small financial issue that was simmering, and it could have become significant. However, the Congogram analysis helped leaders to name that pattern and to recognize how the current pockets of negativity related to past events, not what was actually happening in the present. By looking at the patterns throughout the history of the congregation, leadership was able to resolve the issue before it had a chance to become a serious issue. And like I said, the full case study is available in the course for lay leaders online. The next section is create a vital future. The 6 months of work with a congregation leads to the formation of what's called an emotional process action plan with clearly articulated and measurable goals. The congregation forms an emotional process action plan which includes short-term and long-term goals. This action plan focuses on relationship and styles of interaction, not on programming, materials, or facility. Specific emotional process goals include such things as deepening understanding of relational patterns that work well in a congregation, increasing communication between one group and another, for example, old-timers and newer members, leadership team and the congregation, traditionalists and progressives, or working on decreasing anxiety and reactivity on issues related to whatever it might be, money, leadership, welcoming new members, or working on changing patterns of avoiding discussion of a particular issue. It could be a past traumatic event, a controversial issue, money, or anything, or possibly resolving an ethical debate in a constructive manner. There is a structured process for forming these emotional process goals that involves the whole congregation as well as an action planning team. These goals are not imposed from the outside, but they are developed from the congregation. I provide a structured process and teach how to focus on emotional systems goals rather than programming, facility, and materials. The process begins by forming an action planning team, and this is done different ways depending on the polity and the leadership structure of that particular congregation. The team then leads the process, the action planning process, and I coach them in that. The action planning begins after people have seen the analysis of the congregation and have done a detailed homework assignment encouraging reflection on the Congogram analysis. This reflection involves reflecting on one's own participation in the systems patterns that are named, both in the congregation and noticing ways that some of those patterns might be taking place in your individual family system as well. After that homework is done, the congregation is broken down based on existing groups and committees to do group reflection and action planning. They look for common themes and create a group vision of the congregation 5 years from the present. And from there, they propose goals that could lead the congregation to that vision. For example, a congregation which identified major communication issues set goals on working on patterns of reactivity around issues related to a clergy person and on increasing communication between the leadership and the congregation. Like a sunrise, the whole process of change takes time. When the congregational counselor finishes the on-site work, the action planning and working towards the goals continues. I then do follow-up phone calls, and I'm available for further consultation as needed. This is a sample of the courses that are available online on my website. Like I said, the full case study of the West Coast Unitarian Universalist congregation is included in the course for lay leaders. That's the level 2 course for lay leaders. That also includes a case study of Sandra, the treasurer, and another lay leader in the congregation. The course for clergy includes a case study of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church and case study of the clergy person in that congregation. These courses are designed for readers who don't have any connection to these case study congregations, but the process fosters their own individual reflection. And this is fostered through case studies, through course materials, there's an online test with each section. There are diagrams, there are reflection questions, and prompts for journaling and that kind of thing. The courses are not directly connected with the counseling process. So a congregation can do the whole counseling process and never do the courses. Individuals can do the courses and never do the on-site counseling process. They can complement each other, but they don't need to. The cost of the Congogram counseling process is identical to that I charge for pastoral counseling when I'm working with individuals, couples, and families, with the exception that I charge half price for the hours they spend at home analyzing the data and creating the Congogram diagrams. The costs shown on the website reflect the maximum price that a congregation of each size will be charged for the basic Congogram package. If the work is done in less hours, then it's less money. For congregations under significant financial stress, I am willing to do the work for half price, 50% off, with the agreement that if in the year following my work with the congregation, the operating increase, the congregation then pay that increase towards payment for the work that I have done. The website itself has a wealth of information on it, more information about congregational counseling, opportunities for study and reflection. There is a reflection page which has a weekly article on a wide variety of subjects related to family and congregational systems. And I also offer a free weekly newsletter that you can sign up for through the website. It's one page, and it brings the weekly article to your email inbox and includes journal prompts for further reflection. I talked already about the courses and how that promotes self-reflection. And the courses can provide change in yourself and even in your congregation, your involvement in your congregation, even if you're the only one doing it. Although there are also opportunities for groups to engage the courses together. The whole point of the Congogram and the Congogram process is to change the world at the intersection of the congregation and the family. It's designed to help clergy people and lay leaders to do this work. There is a very powerful energy at the intersection of the congregation and the family. At times, clergy and congregants use that power at the intersection of the congregation and family life intentionally in positive ways or intentionally in negative ways. But more often, the expression of that energy comes from a random mix of family systems at work over the history of the congregation, of a particular congregation. And so the Congogram process is designed to help congregations and the people within those congregations to intentionally develop their full positive potential by thinking through the emotional systems patterns and by setting goals. This is my contact information. Please feel free to contact me after the webinar if you have further questions or would like to do some work with the Congogram process.